Hey guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. After 300 episodes, you may be thinking, wait a second, this isn't Steve, and you're absolutely right. This time, it's me, Pascal. As I just mentioned, it's our 300th episode of the Revive Stronger podcast, and I wanted to take the moment to thank every single one of you for your continued support. No matter if you just joined our podcast recently or you're here since episode number 1, we wouldn't be here without you. As you know, Steve is the host of the podcast. However, I am the man behind the scenes. I've decided to spice up the look of the podcast a bit more, and I did the same thing for some of our website pages, such as, for example, our online coaching page. Not only that, we decided to revive our newsletter, pun absolutely intended, and we will bring you much more valuable content via the newsletter as well. So make sure to check out our newly designed pages and sign up for our newsletter to get the latest news in our ecosystem. One last thing though, in order to continue with our podcast, we rely on your help. Hitting the like button, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment in the comment section below helps us tremendously. So again, thank you so much for 300 episodes together, your love and support. And now, without further ado, let's delve into the episode with Doug Brignole and Mike Israetel.
Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I have the pleasure of hosting a roundtable discussion between Doug Brignole and Mike Israetel. These guys have been discussing a little bit back and forth about different viewpoints on exercise selection and biomechanics and muscle physiology maybe. And I think we're going to jump into some of those, and I think we'll hopefully find some agreements, maybe some disagreements, and some healthy debate and discussion. I thought I'd start with kind of some things, at least from me digesting their content. Some of the things they definitely agree on is kind of letting go of ego. I like this, where kind of removing attachment to certain lifts. People love to squat, bench, deadlift, for example, for hypertrophy, maybe not the way to go. And also attaching themselves to like ego lifting, just heavy loads for the sake of it. Whereas kind of, I think both Mike and Doug are coming from the standpoint of trying to maximize a hypertrophic stimulus for limited fatigue, but they might kind of approach that idea differently. So I think there's some differences in opinion surrounding exercise selection for muscle growth, maybe down to differences in background. And Doug, as a brief introduction to you, and feel free to add to this, he started at the age of 14, so really young, and has competing till 54, incredibly jacked, been very successful in that. I've had the pleasure to read his book up to chapter 7. There's 22 chapters, so I'm not all the way through. He published The Physics of Resistance Exercise, Biomechanical Factors to Determine How Good or Bad an Exercise is for Muscle Growth. And then Mike, for those who aren't aware of Mike, and a lot of the listeners probably will be if they're kind of loyal listeners. So Mike has a PhD in sports physiology. He's an NPC superweight bodybuilder and a content producer. So produced the scientific principles of muscle hypertrophy. And one of the terms that I think we'll probably refer to, and I already have today, kind of he coined, was the stimulus to fatigue ratio, amongst many other terms that relate to exercise selection. So I don't know if Doug, to start with you, if you want to add anything to your background, because I know that was quite brief, and then talk about kind of some of the factors you consider when you are picking exercises for muscle hypertrophy for the bodybuilder.
So I'm 62 years old now. And I started when I was 14. So I've been lifting for 43, 44 years. And you know, what I think is important to understand is I do not disagree with exercise physiologists. And I think that's a common misunderstanding, is that somehow what they say and what I say clash. What I say is that these are two separate fields, and they can actually connect. And what happens is, and I've spoken with a number of exercise physiologists, is that there's an understanding, or a belief anyway, that if you're an exercise physiologist, that somehow you also know physics, that you somehow also know the nuances of exercise mechanics, and they're different, right? So I think the exercise physiologists that have read my book have not disagreed with anything I've said in my book. In fact, I'm speaking at St. Mary's College, March 24th. I spoke at Quincy College in November, And it dovetails nicely. It doesn't disagree with or clash with anything that has to do with periodization, fatigue. It's just that when it gets right down to exercise selection, there's an enormous amount of physics that determines how much load a muscle gets. And some people would say, well, what Doug is trying to do is teach people how to train light, or to teach people who are older how to work out, or people who have been injured how to work out. And I would say, no, I mean, certainly it works that way. But what I try to do is maximize the percentage of load that a muscle gets that you're using. So for example, if you're going to load a muscle, not that you would know this off the top of your head, but if you're going to load a muscle with 90 pounds of resistance, you could select an exercise that delivers 90% of that, of what you're using. So you'd be using 100 pounds to deliver 90 pounds, or you could be using 300 pounds, 30% goes to the muscle. So the muscle only knows the 90 pounds. It doesn't know that you're lifting 300 pounds or 100 pounds. The skeleton does, the joints do. So it makes sense to use the most efficient percentage of loading that you can, and then, mix that with the physiological aspects that I don't ever argue with Brad Schoenfeld or Mike Israetel or any of the people, Wayne Westcott, who have their recommendations. That's fine. But the part that I address is the actual percentage of loading.
Okay. And I guess something that might lead to is, and I think I've seen this with some of your thoughts surrounding exercise selection, is less kind of focus on the compound lifts in general, and maybe a biasing towards many more exercises and more isolation-based exercises because they're more precise, I guess.
Well, basically what I'm saying is that if you have three muscles that are working during a compound exercise, each muscle is doing its job. It doesn't really know that another muscle is working over there, another one is working over there. So what we have to ask ourselves is, like, if you're doing a squat, the glutes are working, the hamstrings are working, well, to some degree, the quads are working, the erector spinae are working. And if you look at each one of those muscles and say, is each one working as best as it can work, as compared to how well it would work if you just isolated that muscle? Because a muscle really only wants to have full range of motion, early phase loading, all these things that are the criteria by which they grow. They get best stimulated, and they don't really care that another. And so sometimes, like if you're doing a parallel bar dip, the muscle that you most prioritize might be the triceps or the pecs, and yet the front deltoid is what's getting loaded the most. The triceps are working, but they're working with a very small percentage of your body weight because the forearm, as the operating lever of the tricep, is not very active. It's not very perpendicular to resistance. And the pectoral muscles want to move away from the insertion, wants to move away from the origin. So that's why when we do pecs, we go laterally out, medially in. And then if you're doing dips, you're not actually doing that motion. So you're getting a compromised pectoral stimulation. So in other words, you can never say parallel bar dips is enough for pecs, or that parallel bar dips is enough for triceps. So you're going to have to do a better tricep exercise and a better pectoral exercise. So why not just do those?
Okay, I understand that. And I guess that's about you're kind of trying to be efficient with your exercise in terms of you are targeting one specific thing versus kind of getting a variety of different things, which I guess is somewhat similar to where I guess someone like Mike would say for very advanced lifters, the conventional deadlift might not be the best choice for hypertrophy because it just ends up without, like, the fatigue cost is not worth the raw stimulus magnitude that you get from that. But it's like a large step further than that because these are very isolated versus like going from a deadlift to a Romanian deadlift, for example. So I don't know if Mike, if that sprung any thoughts or ideas. I don't know if you had enough chance to read through much of Doug's book as well.
Did have a chance. And I think, Doug, you just said that when exercise physiologists have read your book, they haven't really disagreed with much or any of it, I guess. As I'm not an exercise physiologist, I'm a sport physiologist. Tiny little distinction without a difference. I'm joking. There's slight difference, but so I gave the book a few glances, and I picked out 5 specific claims in the book. Can reference them with page numbers where I find some of the claims interesting, and maybe I can ask you about them. And some of them make some pretty good sense to me. Some I'm left curious about. So maybe
Okay.
if I could enumerate the claims, work through them slowly, no bombardment or anything like that. Is that okay with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right, super. So so this is pages as noted by PDF. So I'm not sure if that it corresponds to the exact page number of the book, but on page 296, this is, I believe, in reference to chest training. There is a picture and a graphical representation of a gentleman doing a bench press, very deep. So the bar is all the way down his chest, and his elbows are considerably below his midline. And the quote is, "When the bar is at the level of the chest or close to it, the pectoral muscle is pulling the humerus mostly inward toward the sternum, because that is where the pectoral origins are situated." So far, no disagreement. "As you can see below, this causes the pectoral muscle to pull on the humerus from an almost completely parallel angle. This mechanical disadvantage dramatically increases the force requirement, such that the pectoral muscle can actually pull the humeral head forward out of the glenoid socket." And the quote after that, after the picture says, that's very bad because it does some damage. Is it okay, Doug, if I ask you a few follow-up questions to that?
Absolutely. Sure.
Super. So this would seem to me to be implying that, if we're going all the way down into a very deep stretch in the bench press, and then, the humerus is essentially parallel line to the force pulling of the pecs, the angle, then that might imply that, we shouldn't go down to that depth and work from that angle, because it is potentially injurious, because it dramatically increases the force requirement, and muscle can pull the humeral head out of the glenoid socket, which is very bad. Glenohumeral dislocation is probably a really bad idea. So do I take that to mean that you're not super into the whole super deep stretch at the bottom of the bench press idea, and you think it's maybe not worth it?
Well, let me start off by saying that I always prefer dumbbells over barbell, in part because you can get a full range of motion. You can actually bring the insertion of the pectoral closer to the origin of the pectoral. That's number one. But if the question is, am I discouraging people from going very deep on a stretch with, let's say, a dumbbell press, a flat dumbbell press, or a decline dumbbell press, I would say that a couple of things. Number one is, I don't know if you read the chapter on mechanical disadvantage, but I explained there how and why it is that the force requirement drastically goes up. And basically, what I would say is it's safer, obviously, to go deep stretch when the weight is moderate to light, and less dangerous when the weight is super heavy. So I would actually discourage someone from bottoming out full stretch on a 4-rep, meaning a weight that barely allows 4 reps, dumbbell press. Yes, because, and I wouldn't say so much that the biggest risk is having the glenoid, the humeral head come out of the glenoid socket. I don't think that's the biggest risk. I think the bigger risk is actual having a pectoral tear, a pectoral rupture. And we've seen pectoral ruptures happen, and when they happen, they always happen at the bottom. Now, having said that, I will say we know that early phase loading is important, and we know that full range of motion is important. And what I explain in my book about range of motion, I don't know if you got to this part, what I say is that you can't make a blanket statement that full range of motion is always good, because it depends on the exercise. It depends on the mechanics of the exercise. I wouldn't bottom out on a preacher curl, but I would certainly bottom out on a standing curl. There's the flexion muscles, the muscles that flex a joint, the biceps, the pecs, the hamstrings, the lats. They're the ones that have the greatest difference between mechanical advantage and disadvantage. And they're usually the ones that tear. It's not usually the extension muscles that tear, because they're always working at mechanical disadvantage, and they've adapted to that. So what I would say is that the pectoral muscle is less vulnerable than the bicep muscle in mechanical disadvantage. There's less risk bottoming out on a dumbbell press than there is bottoming out on a preacher barbell curl. But still, when I do my dumbbell presses, I go deep stretch until I start getting into the heavier weight, and then I stay about 10% out of the bottom.
Do you think that if we train in the most productive bodybuilding ranges, like sets of 5 to 30 reps, that pectoral tear or glenoid dislocation is a significant risk deep in the bottom of a press? Or do
Well,
you
I think there's a huge
only when-
difference. I'm sorry, there's a huge difference between 5 reps and 30 reps, assuming the weight is appropriate for the number of reps. I mean, 30 reps would be considered light. 20 reps would be considered light. 15 would still be even considered relatively light. Once you start getting into your maybe 8, but certainly 6s and 4s, I think that there's a significant risk in mechanical disadvantage.
So, yeah, I guess just like as a reader, that's not mentioned in that section, that the remedy for this is to go lighter, still allowing a range of motion. It seems to me that that section reads like, hey, to the bottom of the press, based on these biomechanical descriptions, is just kind of a thing that leads to injury. I didn't see any addendum that says, hey, and if you're going lighter, that's totally fine.
Well, if you go to the chapter, range of motion is discussed. It's not called range of motion. I'm trying to think of the name of the chapter where range of motion is discussed. But if you go to the chapter that talks about range of motion, it explains there very clearly that the heavier you go, the wiser it is to stay either 10% out of the bottom or 10% out of the top. And 80% range of motion is arguably sufficient range of motion to cause muscle stimulus. You don't actually need the last 10% and the early 10% if you're going super, super heavy. I love bottoming out on a flat dumbbell press or a decline dumbbell press when I'm doing 30s and 20s, even when I'm doing 15s. But once I start getting into a weight that really challenges me for 10, I start going 5% or 10% away from full stretch. And it just feels better.
You think it's worth sacrificing the range of motion and the pretty well-researched confirmed hypertrophy advantage of going super deep and producing lots of tension in a stretch for the ability to put more weight on the bar, or do you think maybe that's unwise?
Well, as I understand the research, it says that what causes muscle growth is fiber recruitment. And you can get fiber recruitment with higher reps if you're taking that set to failure. And you can get with recruitment with heavier weight, lower reps, even without going to failure. Because it's once it gets to an 80% maximum, 1 rep max, then you get more recruitment automatically. So frankly, I don't even think you need to go to 4 reps. Maybe once upon a time, I thought that heavier had some benefit that you couldn't get with a 10 rep set. I don't believe that anymore. I think that I can get as much growth, or a person can get as much growth with a 10 rep set if they take that 10 rep set to failure, as opposed to going with a weight that allows 4 reps. So the question is, and in fact, I just recently saw, I'll be happy to send this to you, a great video by someone who was explaining the pros and cons of going heavier or lighter. And one of them, of course, was the fact that when you're going heavier, you're not really getting more growth, according to the research. As long as you're doing the lighter weights, 10 reps, 15 reps to failure, you're getting as much growth with those without incurring the risk of injury that you would get going as full a range of motion as you would with a 10 or 15 rep set with a 4 rep set.
So then I guess you wouldn't be a fan of going heavy enough to warrant a range of motion reduction. You would prefer to have a higher range of motion, get that tension at the bottom of the pec press, for example, but keep the weights light enough so that the concerns you express on page 296 don't really have to be addressed, right?
My instinct, from my own training, my instinct is that I don't think I lose much by avoiding the last 10% of the range of motion and going heavier. And you might then say, well, then why do you go there at all? Why not just stay with the lighter weight and the fuller range of motion? And I would say, for one, I like the way the heavier weight feels. And when I say heavier weight, for me, I don't go any lower than 8 anymore. I used to go as heavy as 4. But once I saw the research that, you can get as much growth with the lighter weight as long as you take it to failure, and combined with the research that shows that more frequency is better, I've been getting really good results with 4 sets twice a week for each muscle group. And I typically go 30, 20, 15, 10.
Okay, last question. Thank you so much for clarifying. Last question on this specific page and set of claims. The claim here is that the pectoral muscle can actually pull the humeral head forward out of the glenoid socket, specifically when the force vectors align. So to me, I'm trying to understand how that makes some sense, because if you have like, the glenohumeral joint maybe kind of looks just roughly like this. And let's say the pecs are over here, and if this is the humerus, by the way, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
Shit. And then so like, if you are pulling from, let's say, a 45-degree angle or 90-degree angle or something, then glenodislocation seems that it only has to slip out of the joint this way, and maybe it requires less force to do so. But if you're pulling from the position in which all the force is going directly into the joint, it seems that if it's totally parallel, that dislocation would require you to break physically through the entire joint, which probably require more force, and maybe it would be much less likely. So to me,
you're right. You're right. I mean, it would really require that the arm go behind the back, so that this is not a very good model. But if you could actually create a situation where the arm, the humerus, was around the corner from the sternum, and so the pull was up and around, theoretically, it would be pulling more forward than inward. And that's what it would require theoretically, right? But again, this is just a theoretical thing. I've never known anyone who's done that. But certainly you have to ask yourself, if a muscle is pulling in a certain direction, and the direction in which it's pulling is not into the joint, but forward from the joint before it can go around the corner, theoretically, it could pop it out of the socket.
Isn't that the same angle except reflected? If you just like, if we're here to here, isn't that the same angle as if we're really far behind? So the dislocation could pop forward, or it could just pop this way. Like, isn't that the same amount of force, and vectors are similar?
Well, if you're like this, and the pectoral muscle is pulling from the sternum, and it's going to the shoulder joint and around the corner, and then pulling forward, and then it's pulling it in this direction. Once you get past parallel, then it's pulling in a straight line. It's not pulling from around the corner.
Right, but because it's pulling in a straight line, and there's not much to stop that dislocation. Wouldn't dislocation be equally as likely if you were just here? It would just, because the pec fiber literally just pulls the humerus out, just trying to pull it out of the joint the entire time. So it might be very easier to pull it out if it was back here. Very difficult to pull it out if it was aligned, because then it's pulling bone into bone. But then wouldn't it be like similarly easy to pull it out if it was in front?
Well, there's two things happening. First of all, when you're here, the muscle is actually pulling in two different directions. It's pulling to the shoulder joint, and then from around the corner. So it first has to pull to the corner, then it can pull in, right? So that's why you're pulling. That's where the risk is, because you're not pulling toward the sternum at that point. You're pulling toward the front, because that's the only angle from which it can pull. Once you pass the shoulder, once you pass parallel, not only is now the muscle pulling in one single direction, not around the corner, but in a straight direction, the mechanical advantage improves. In other words, it's less parallel to the humerus.
Yeah.
And more perpendicular.
An improved mechanical advantage would mean it's pulling with more force on the humerus. Wouldn't that increase the likelihood of dislocation? So like if I'm super deep right here, the chest just isn't producing a whole lot of force, because it's losing it. It's stretched out so far that the overlap of contractile elements is lower, and you just can't produce a whole lot of force from here, internal or external. So like a dislocation from way back here seems to me would be less likely than a dislocation from here to here, because there was an immense amount of force angling to dislocate.
Well, here, this is the model that I made, which is actually an arm, right? So this is the humerus, and this is the forearm. This is the bicep insertion, right? So if you were to put this in this position right here, and then pull, which is mechanical disadvantage, you're pulling parallel to this bone, you can feel how much tension you need to get that thing to actually move. Once you get to mechanical advantage, once this is able to pull perpendicular, then it doesn't have to pull with as much force, because it's more efficient. And what I explain in the mechanical disadvantage section is I actually have this device that I use. Started off as a seated calf machine. I knocked off the seat. I knocked off the part that holds your knees, and I welded these little loops on the top of this lever arm. And I tell the audience, if this was your forearm, and this is your elbow over here, the joint, then here's a 10-pound weight. I'm going to put it on your hand, and I slide it on there, and you're holding your forearm parallel to the ground. How much is your bicep holding? So it would be this. It would be this, and it's pulling straight up. how much is it holding? And so it's a trick question. Some people say 10 pounds. And I say, okay, well, let's find out. So I take a fishing scale and I put it in the very first hook, which would be closest to the hand at the wrist. And I pull up and it's already like 12 or 15 pounds. And as I move down the arm, of course, it gets heavier and heavier and heavier. When I get to the very last hook, it's like 120 pounds, but it's still only 10 pounds over there. So the first thing that shows is that the lever length is magnifying the 10 pounds, right? And so I say, if we've got 120 pounds, when I pull straight up, that's mechanical advantage because I'm pulling perpendicular to the lever. Now let's pull at a 45-degree angle halfway between up and in, and let's see what that is. And so I pull on the scale and it says 240 pounds. Okay, why is it 240 pounds? Well, because I still need 120 pounds to go up. But now only half of my effort is up and the other half is in. So I have to double it in order to still get my 120 up. And the lower I go, the heavier it is. Now, if I went around the corner, if I went below the joint, it would be harder still.
Hey, Pascal here. I just wanted to take the moment to talk about our membership site. Inside, you'll find a thriving forum, an extensive exercise library, courses, presentations, and research reviews. All I need you to do is hit the link in the description below and sign up. See you there.
Right. So because some of the force is leveraged into the joint versus just leveraged into the humerus. So if we're pulling at an angle, you know, like some of the force is just going into the joint and some of it's pulling the humerus up this way, versus if we're perpendicular, almost all of it is pulling the humerus up this way. Because humeral dislocation occurs by an excessive amount of force pulling the humerus without as much joint reaction force and thus joint stability, wouldn't the chance of pulling the humerus out of the joint be highest when we're perpendicular, not at any other angle at which you just waste a lot of your effort into the joint, thus actually creating stability instead of instability?
Well, if you drew an arrow from the insertion of the pec and you drew it at the various phases of the range of motion, and once the arm is below the chest and you drew that arrow going in this direction, you can see that you're not going toward the sternum nor toward the joint. You're going forward before it can actually head towards the sternum. Once it passes parallel, it's going straight to the sternum. So the force then is not actually pulling the joint in an unnatural direction. It's just pulling the humerus toward the pectorum, toward the insertion. That's all, toward the origin on the sternum. It's not pulling it in a direction that is out of the socket. I mean, you must have felt this when you're doing it yourself. You probably never felt any shoulder instability when you start getting closer to completion.
I've never really felt any shoulder instability in general. And to that end, are you familiar with any humeral dislocation injuries during bench pressing?
Well, I've seen videos of people snapping their, that's why I said earlier, I think the bigger risk is snapping a pectoral tendon. Theoretically, and I think I use the word theoretically in that section, I say you're pulling the humerus in a direction that is not toward the joint, you're pulling it forward. So theoretically, so the question I ask myself, or the question I would encourage anyone to ask, is if you're doing a very, very heavy 1 rep max, and you're coming all the way to touch the bar onto your chest, in order to do that, your humerus has to go well below the level of the bench and the shoulder joint. What's the pro and what's the con? What's the possible gain and what are the risks? You're certainly not going to get much hypertrophy with 1 rep, right? So you could tear a pectoral muscle and you could dislocate a shoulder joint. These are theoreticals. They don't happen every time, but these are the theoretical risks. And what's the possible gain? I would say, and my audience for the most part is the hypertrophy audience. It's the bodybuilder.
So next question for you, Doug, and again, thank you so much for your time. Page 300, there is a few pictures of gentlemen deadlifting with less than stellar technique, and the direct quote is spinal compression as mediated by the deadlift. Spinal compression is a serious problem, especially as we get older. There are millions of people who struggle with spinal compression who never pulled 200 pounds, 300s, or 400-pound barbell during a deadlift. We don't need any help adding to the spinal compression problem. The less spinal compression we cause in our lifetime, the better. So my understanding is that people who spend their lives entirely devoid of spinal compression end up wildly magnifying the risk for osteopenia and osteoporosis, because gradual introduction of spinal compression through lifts like the deadlift actually strengthen various elements of the spine, including the vertebral bone density, and thus actually put you at significantly less risk. So to me, this section seems like it's advocating not doing deadlifts because deadlifts cause spinal compression and that's bad, but isn't gradual introduction and continuing progressive overload of spinal compression kind of a good thing that makes us a bit less fragile? So like if someone has a really strong deadlifting background and comes to me to say, hey, they want to be a bodybuilder now, I'm not so worried about them ever hurting their back, because, you know, if you pull 700 or 800 pounds, there's nothing in bodybuilding that's going to hurt your back. But if you come from a background of the couch and you never put your spine into a loaded position, and thus your spine is probably just has less bone density than it could, then isn't the compressive element then introduced with training or your regular life or just sitting there probably a real bad thing? Because it seems to me like you're advocating we don't deadlift. The less spinal compression we cause in our lifetime, the better. But to me, it seems that if we introduce spinal compression gradually over time, that we actually make ourselves much more resistant to injury than trying to avoid it altogether. What do you think about that?
That's fair. So there's several issues here. The first issue is we're not comparing a person who deadlifts 600 pounds to a couch potato. Okay, we're comparing a person who deadlifts 600 pounds to a person who doesn't deadlift 600 pounds, or maybe doesn't deadlift at all, but still does dumbbell shrugs, that still does hack squats, that still carries the weight to and from a bench. In other words, weight training loads the spine just by virtue of moving weights around and other exercises, right? So what I'm saying is, when I'm looking at a deadlift and I say, okay, what does a deadlift work? What are the pros and cons of a deadlift? Okay, so and you said you see pictures here of people doing deadlifts with less than stellar form. Okay, so my point there is to show that the most active joint during a deadlift is the hip joint. It's mostly hip extension, a tiny bit of knee extension, an isometric contraction of the erector spinae to maintain rigidity in the spine so it doesn't fold forward. Now, the weak link in the chain there is the erector spinae. It has much less power potential than the glutes, than the hip extensors, right? So if you take, let's say, 200 pounds, perfect form, 300 pounds, perfect form, at some point when you're increasing the weight to max out your deadlift, you will discover that your glutes have much more strength than your erector spine. And at some point, the erector spinae start to fail first. They're the ones that start to round forward. And people, being as competitive as they tend to be, will usually push the limits until they actually start to forward flex their spine, maybe even unaware that they're doing it. And they're doing that ostensibly for hip extension, or should we call it posterior chain strength. What I would recommend is you can work the glutes and the hip extension muscles with a multi-hip machine and avoid the bilateral deficit and avoid putting anything on your spine and get the full femur length and get more magnification and more load on each of your glutes by doing a multi-hip machine, even though it's far less impressive to watch and maybe less fun, by the way, then loading your spine with a deadlift. And then you can work your erector spinae dynamically by actually arching your spine with holding a weight onto your chest with a weight that actually is appropriate for the erector spinae strength, and get the best of both worlds. Look, when I do my shrugs, I use, 70, 80 pounds in each hand. I'm getting spinal compression. I'm getting enough osteoporosis prevention stimulus. I'm not saying don't load your spine at all, don't load your skeleton at all. I'm just saying you won't lose anything, and you'll probably, avoid future problems if you don't excessively load your spine.
So the direct quote here is, the less spinal compression we cause in our lifetime, the better. Maybe
that's overstated, because that would suggest that no spinal compression at all would be ideal. And you're right, that would be an improper statement to make. I'm not saying that. So, but what I do say is you don't want to excessively, especially when you compare the benefits of that exercise to the cons.
Right, I got you. Okay, that makes more sense. All right, number 3, page 373, the following quote: "There are no pectoral fiber origins above the shoulder, nor above the clavicles. So it is impossible for the pectoralis to participate much in pulling the arms, the humerus, in a direction that is above the clavicle line. Yet one of the most common exercises performed in the gym is an incline press, which moves the arms in a direction where there are no pectoral fibers. The illustration below shows where the pectorals would have to pull in order to produce an incline movement. So,
and describe that illustration.
Yeah, I think it's an individual who is, it seems, is the arms raised completely to the sides. And
No, it's a man pulling a rope, isn't it?
yeah. Well, so the skeleton is arranged like this, right? And the man pulling the rope is a tiny miniature man who's pulling the end of the humerus there.
And he's pulling it from the where? From the chin.
Yeah, right. He is.
So what I'm suggesting there is that in order for a pectoral muscle to pull in the direction that is above the shoulder line, there would have to be a muscle fiber that is situated above the shoulder line in order to do that.
And then so the after that picture, the rest of the quote is, in other words, incline presses do not, emphasis is yours, work the upper pectoralis very well. Even though we've been told for years that the best exercise for the upper pecs is the incline press, this has been conventional wisdom for decades, and I guess is wrong. So my question here is, so if we're pulling our arms from here to here, yeah, totally, that is not the clavicular pectoralis. However, I think almost everyone who does incline benches by keeping their arms here and pressing like this, which the clavicular fibers of the pectoralis contribute to primarily, and thus incline benching done in the manner in which almost all people do it, and in the manner most exercise textbooks instruct, actually is probably very good for the upper pecs. In my view, would you disagree with that? Or?
Well, here's what I explain, and I can see that you didn't read all the different sections, but here's what I say. If your arms are down at your side, you're looking at an anatomy chart, and you're looking at the pectoral fibers, and your insertion is here. These fibers do seem to run up to the clavicular origins, and then, of course, they go to the sternal origins, and then, of course, the costal origins. Now, if you were to move your arm from this position, if you were to move your arm from the position of being down in an upward direction, certainly you're moving toward the clavicle. You're engaging the clavicular fiber, there's no doubt. The question you'd have to ask, we don't have to ask, is at what point do we need to stop? In other words, once you get closest to the clavicle, I'm pretty much contracting my clavicular fiber right there. Do I need to go above it?
Now, I don't think anyone incline barbell presses this. I mean, that's impossible. Well, the bar stops like right here. So it's from here to here, and that seems to target the clavicular fibers.
So here's what I show. What I show is that there's an illustration there. Let me see if I can pull it up here. I can just show it to you on print. Here it is. So there's this picture, right here.
Mm-hmm.
So what that shows is that if I'm trying to move my insertion away from the midline as far as possible, I'm going to go mostly laterally, right? So you're looking at me from the side. If I do a flat press, I'm already moving toward the highest part of my sternum. If I do an incline press, I'm not moving towards this spot. I'm moving toward this spot. There's a picture in there that shows a very, very lean woman that I train, and she's doing a flat dumbbell press. She's so lean, you can actually see that when you raise your arms up like this, the clavicles shift into this direction, and then they're straight across from the humerus. So you can see that her clavicular pectorals are actually working at least as much, if not more, than the highest sternal fibers when she's doing a flat dumbbell press. So there's no real advantage beyond that in moving in a direction where there are fewer pectoral fibers located than a straight flat dumbbell press.
So maybe people incline bench in order to hit preferentially the clavicular fibers and not hit the more sternal and abdominal fibers, because maybe their pecs, like many people's pecs, have a very large lower component and a deficient upper component. You know, in bodybuilding, you want that upper chest armor plated look. So maybe I think it's quite true to say that a full range of motion bench press may actually recruit pretty much almost all of your pectoral fibers, clavicular, sternal, and abdominal / costal. But would an incline press recruit the abdominal and costal fibers less, and thus maybe let you focus more as a priority on the upper pecs?
I don't think you meant abdominal.
It's how they're referenced in the literature in many cases.
The rectus abdominis?
The abdominal fibers, so they're called costal and they're also called abdominal. It's
abdominal.
In the abdominal.
Oh, okay. Oh, because they move in that direction. Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I get it.
And they're attached to what's called just the abdominal area.
Okay.
Costal is a perfectly fine nomenclature.
You know, when I do my favorite front deltoid exercise, which is on a slight decline bench, and I bring my arms down and up toward the sternum, up toward the the clavicles, I am actually stimulating the clavicular pectoral fibers because I'm coming from a down angle towards an up angle. So you can do that. You can even grab a pair of cables low and you can go up in an upward direction. But you see, I still don't have to go above my shoulder line to do that. And we've had a lot of people that have been doing nothing but slight decline dumbbell presses who've told me they've gotten better upper pectoral developed now than they did when they were doing incline presses and less shoulder discomfort.
Do you think most people's experience mirrors that? Like, so for example, if you saw a competitor who walked off the stage and maybe you were a judge or a consultant, and as clearly his upper pecs were lagging compared to his lower pecs, and he says, hey, listen, I know my upper pecs are small. I need to go hammer all the exercises that hit him. And one of the exercises he listed was the incline dumbbell or incline barbell press. Would you say, hey, listen, that's actually not a good idea. You should do these other exercises? I
would say, you know, there was a time, my pecs have always been my most difficult body part. I've tried everything. And there was a time when I said, I'm going to do 1 year of nothing but incline work. I didn't do any flats. I didn't do any decline. And certainly if the incline angle is the right angle, then I will have better than ever upper pectoral development. And I didn't. It was the worst pectoral development I ever had. Here's another thing to ponder, and that is when you're in the gym or even yourself, if you're observing someone or you're doing it yourself and you finish doing a set of incline presses and you want to check your pump, or maybe the next day you want to check your upper pectoral soreness, how do you test it? You don't test it like this. You sense, if I want to flex my upper pecs, I know it flexes best here. If I try to do this, it's evasive. I cannot get that kind of contraction that I can get here. There's a reason for that. I'm trying to bring, when we flex a muscle to test it, we're bringing the insertion as close as we can to the origin. And we know that's kind of where that movement should end. If that's where that muscle contracts best, shouldn't that be a clue as to where an exercise for that muscle should end?
Yeah, for sure. I don't think most people incline by going like this. I think most people incline press by going like this. So if you just watch the movement of where my elbow is in relation to the clavicular fibers, it seems pretty much in alignment. You know,
well, what you're doing right there looks like a flat press to me.
Well, so it's in this direction right here, right? That's not a flat press. That's how I incline press. I think that's how you're supposed to incline press.
Well, what I would say is, and very simply, and again, I've always said, you know, I'm not saying my way is the best way, but I am saying check the logic of this, right? When you're doing an incline press or a flat press, or you're watching someone do an incline press or a flat press, watch the insertion on the upper arm bone and ask yourself, is it moving directly toward those fiber origins or not? And that's all I do is challenge people.
Yeah. I think if we're incline pressing like this, or if we're incline pressing like this, then the answer is this one probably is mechanically impossible. And then this one is you're just going to recruit mostly front delts like this. But if you're pressing like this, then it seems like there's a crap load of clavicular fibers directly in the way, ostensibly pulling. And when I do that movement with dumbbells or barbells, I get a pump in my upper chest.
Yeah.
I get sore. I get growth.
Yeah.
It seems to make sense.
If you get on an incline bench with a pair of dumbbells or whatever, and you do that motion you just did, that early part certainly is moving toward the clavicle, but at some point, you're going past the clavicle. And so I would say the early phase probably does exactly what you want it to do. And then the second half of it goes beyond, goes past it. So,
wide grip incline would probably be better then?
Wide grip. Well, as I said, I don't like barbell, but, I think if you bring your elbows down with dumbbells or even with barbell and the early part of that, clearly, if you observe someone, you can see that insertion moving toward the origin. That's all good. But at some point, you can see it's going past the origin. And so I would argue that it's not as effective at that point. Whereas if you do a flat or even a slight decline, you're engaging pretty much all of those fibers. What I was going to say was, part of the problem that we as a bodybuilding society have is that we're sort of afraid to test. We mix all of our exercises up. And then the next day, when you say, well, my upper pecs are sore, you can't really say which exercise caused it because you did 3 exercises, right? So I would say, if you really want to test this stuff, take one exercise and do that one exercise for at least 3 weeks, if not 4 weeks. And then make a determination on how effective you think that one exercise was. Then take another exercise and test that for 3 or 4 weeks. I think it's we look at Arnold Schwarzenegger or Franco Columbu, who had fantastic upper pecs, and we see them doing upper incline presses, and we make the assumption that that's the one that created that growth. But how do we know that they wouldn't have had that kind of upper pectoral development just by doing flats? We don't know. It's tainted evidence.
All right, next one, page 534. You could kill someone with this book if you just threw it at them, which garners my respect for sure. All right, page 534 is on hamstring training. And the quote here is, quote, a straight-legged deadlift, pictured just below, does not cause sufficient contraction, muscle shortening of the hamstrings to produce muscle growth the same way that moving our straight arm back and then forward would not be sufficient biceps contraction to stimulate growth. So the claim here is the stiff-legged deadlift, straight-legged deadlift, does not cause sufficient contraction of the hamstrings to produce muscle growth. So I'm to understand that the claim is that the stiff-legged deadlift is not a growth-promoting exercise for the hamstrings. Is that the claim?
What I would say is that it's not nearly as productive for the hamstring development as a leg curl is. In other words, for the same reason that you would not expect the bicep to grow by doing the exact same movement as would be considered a stiff-legged deadlift. If you did something that looked like this, yes, you're stretching the bicep, but if you just did this, you wouldn't really expect much bicep growth because you intuitively know that you need to actually flex that elbow as you would have to flex the knee to get the bicep femoris versus the bicep brachii.
Why wouldn't we get bicep growth like that?
Well, because you're relying entirely on stretch.
And why is that not growth promoting? I thought there was a pretty good literature. Just stretch under load is a very growth promoting modality.
Well, stretch mediated, right? In other words, if you went like this on an incline bench and you did your curls like this, you're getting your bicep stretch and a contraction, right? I'm not saying eliminate the stretch part of the stretch phase of any exercise. I'm not saying that. I'm saying to eliminate the flexion part of an exercise, the full shortening, or at least a 3/4 shortening of a muscle, is arguably insufficient to cause muscle growth. Could you make your pecs grow just with a stretch?
If it was a loaded stretch, yeah, totally.
Just down here, nothing but this?
Well, so the stiff-legged deadlift doesn't just occur down here. The stiff-legged deadlift occurs when you go like this and present a stretch, and then you usually return back to the position. So the hamstrings do go through a shortening cycle as well as a lengthening cycle. That's how they move your torso, I guess. So doesn't a stiff-legged deadlift take the hamstrings through a pretty significant range of motion, though not their full range of motion, but a pretty significant chunk of that really deep stretch position, which might be the most hypertrophic for them?
if I had the choice between doing a seated leg curl, during which I held onto those handles and pulled myself forward, so then when my leg is straight, I'm getting maximum hamstring stretch, and then I flex the knee and I get full hamstring contraction. That to me seems much more full range of motion, much more productive than just getting the stretch without the knee flexion. I just think the knee flexion is an important part of hamstring training.
Okay, so the claim there is the hamstrings, the straight-legged deadlift does not cause sufficient contraction of the hamstrings to produce muscle growth. So you would say that maybe that's a bit of an extreme statement, and maybe as much muscle growth as including a full range contraction.
Keeping in mind, of course, that there's never been a double-blind study to show this, right? And again, I think we would have a hard time getting volunteers to say, okay, you over there, you 50 people over there, you're not going to do any kind of knee flexion exercise for your hamstrings. You're just going to do deadlifts. And this group over here, you're just going to do leg curls. If you did do that study, I feel very strongly that the group that's doing the knee flexion version of hamstring contraction is going to get a better result, significantly better result.
And this is based on what sort of reasoning, Doug?
Just the reasoning that in all of our exercises that we do, whether we're talking about quadricep training, tricep training, bicep training, lat training, all of those exercises utilize full shortening of the muscle, full contraction of the muscle. So why would we think that the hamstring is the one exception that you don't need knee flexion, you don't need full shortening of that muscle? Seems to me that if you're going to get as much benefit or close to as much benefit with the stiff-legged deadlift for the hamstrings, then it proves that we don't need contraction for any muscle. We can stop short of, we can leave the last 60, 70, 80% of the range of motion unfinished, unflexed for all of our muscles, for our pecs, for our biceps, for our triceps, for our quadriceps, and it's perfectly okay because we got maximum stretch. I think that's a difficult argument to believe.
So stiff-legged deadlifts then maybe do cause some muscle growth, but in your view, less per number of sets done than like leg curls, for example.
Yeah, I would say, again, if we look at empirically everything else that we do for muscle growth, you would never think to eliminate the last 60, 70% of the range of motion of all the muscles and expect decent growth.
So there's a recent study specifically on leg extension, which they did the three groups. One did the whole thing. One group just did the bottom, the half. The other did just the top half. And the bottom half only group actually beat the other two groups in hypertrophy. What do you think about that finding? Do you think it'll be replicated, or is it just kind of like a wonky finding that won't stand?
Well, that's a really good question. Look, I think we all know that the early part of the range of motion is the most important part. I say that throughout my book. The first third of the range of motion is far more important than the last third in terms of productivity. And I explained there that, I'm trying to think, William Kramer, PhD, wrote a whole paper on, the advantages of the strength curve of a muscle being loaded, the early phase being loaded more, and why. So I would not be the least bit surprised of a study that shows that the first third of a leg extension is far more productive than the last third. But it does
actually productive than the full ROM too.
That's what surprises me. Unless the study was done in a way that somehow caused the full ROM people to have more fatigue and quit earlier than the people who did.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think maybe the thing is that because the bottom half is so hypertrophic, that any energy you spend doing the bottom and top half means that you get fewer quality repetitions at that bottom half. And thus the top half mostly just tires you out, doesn't produce a lot of growth.
That's what I was suggesting, yeah.
Right. So maybe in a similar way, a stiff-legged deadlift is super productive because you don't have to go through that full hamstring range of motion. You can just focus on that deep stretch in that bottom half or third of the hamstring's entire ability to move. Yeah. And then maybe that means stiff-legged deadlifts can be very hypertrophic because just looking at what bodybuilders and weightlifters and powerlifters do, what they experience, powerlifters, for example, oftentimes never do leg curls, and they many times have comparably sized hamstrings to bodybuilders. So it seems like, some of that work could be beneficial. And then in addition to that, experientially, I think a lot of people, like, so for example, I used to think that leg curls were a completely ineffective exercise altogether, that I would do 3 sets of 10 or whatever, and I just wouldn't get sore at all. No pump, I just kept moving around.
Wow.
And then, and then I did my first 3 sets of 12 of stiff-legged deadlifts with 205 pounds, I'll never forget. And I was actually unable to walk properly for 1 whole week and unable to train my hamstrings for another week after that. And then still a little sore for another half weeks, 2.5 weeks. I thought I was for sure going to die. But it seemed to me that, that sort of continued my experience, that the stiff-legged deadlift and the good morning, by putting the hamstrings into incredibly stretched and loaded position, seemed to cause a crap load of delayed onset muscle soreness. And maybe that means that they're causing a lot of tension to be developed, and that tension can be hypertrophic. And maybe they're a really good exercise, especially as far as number of sets done. So if you say, hey, you got 2 sets of leg curls to do, grow muscle, I'm going to be like, oh shit, I need like 5 or 6. Whereas for a stiff-legged deadlift, good mornings, 2 sets is more than enough to get me sore for like half a week. Do you have a similar experience, Doug, or do you have a different experience, or do you sort of discount the value of soreness as an indicator of much?
Well, no, I think soreness is good. I think soreness is an indicator. There was a time when I did everything. I mean, I started with Bill Pearl back in, when I was 16 years old, 1976. So I've done everything. I've done deadlifts. I've done power cleans. I've done everything. I've never experienced the kind of hamstring soreness from stiff-legged deadlifts that I experienced from leg curls. And even before I started examining, the possible reasons, I always was much more gratified with my hamstring workouts when I did leg curls. But I'm open-minded. Look, I mean, I think that it's possible that a person could grow hamstrings with just stiff-legged deadlifts, but I think it would be the anomaly. I think it would be the sort of the unusual, because as I said, if you can grow hamstrings as well or better without any knee flexion, then we should take that same premise and be able to apply it to every single other muscle, namely the bicep brachii, which is the most similar to the hamstring, and ask ourselves, is that a reasonable thing to believe? I don't think it's reasonable that you could build your bicep brachii without elbow flexion.
Interesting. It's a good point. For me, if I try to get my biceps really far behind my body, what I tend to notice is that in hamstrings, if I'm arching my back properly, the hamstrings really are the limiting factor in flexibility and thus force production and a hip extension with an lordotic lower back and everything. So at the bottom of a stiff-legged deadlift for good morning, my hamstrings physically feel like they're tearing. I'm like, holy shit, something has to be happening. There's clearly some tension there. With biceps, it seems like my front delts, perhaps the glenohumeral joint structure, and even my pecs stretch the most. So my biceps at the very furthest back I can pull my arms don't ever seem to really get that kind of nasty stretch and burn. So maybe if our bodies were designed differently, because the analogy is good between biceps and hamstrings, but the joint design is a bit different. So I think if we could somehow get our biceps to stretch super, super far without being limited by other structures, maybe they could grow a ton.
Well, that's actually true. When I, a long time ago, when I was told that the incline dumbbell curl was especially good because it stretches the bicep, the first thing I thought when I did it was, I feel this stretching in my hand and my front deltoid.
Sure.
I don't actually feel it so much. So, and I do think you're right about the fact that they have different structures, and the lordotic position makes a huge difference, right? If you just a little bit of an arch in the spine, bam, that hamstring tightens up. If you do a hip flexion where you're just standing and you round your back, you can get your leg up a lot higher.
Yeah.
If you arch your back, half as far.
For sure.
So the lordotic position does make a big difference. That's true. Again, I'm open-minded. I tend to think, based on what I've seen and what I felt, that the stiff-legged deadlift doesn't come close to stimulating the hamstrings as well, but I'm open-minded. And I'm also open-minded to, I always like the idea of saying, okay, if something works, let's understand the mechanism. Let's be able to say, here's why it works. Rather than just saying, well, the EMG study says, so therefore, well, okay, great, but let's find out the reasoning.
Right, for sure. So one last one, page, out of order, my apologies, page 421.
Oh, that's okay.
It's a discussion of the lats, and there is a discussion of a one-arm lat pull-in exercise, and the quote is as follows: another benefit of this particular exercise is that we're able to pull our upper arm down and inward farther than we would be able to with a lat pull down. This provides a more ideal range of motion, less at the top where it's risky and more at the bottom for better contraction. So my question to you, Doug, is I didn't quite understand this. What specifically is risky about the top end of the range of motion of the lat?
Okay. The first thing is there's a part in there, I think it's in the mechanical disadvantage section, where I'm saying if you were to do, let's say, a chin up or a pull down with a narrow grip, let's say a grip that's that wide, and your arms are way up here, then your latissimus muscle is basically coming up and connecting to the humerus almost parallel to it. So when it pulls, and it's pulling toward the spine, of course, and the back part of the pelvis, it's pulling this mostly down, and yet you want this bone to go out.
Why do you want it to go out?
Well, because that it's hinging on the joint. It's hinging, right? In other words, you can't make, if the shoulder is like this, you can't get that humerus to go like this, right? It has to hinge around the shoulder joint, and yet it's pulling in this direction, and it can't come out of the socket, right? So there's huge mechanical disadvantage there.
Hi guys, Steve here. Just wanted to take a moment of your time to remind you of our online coaching service. At Revive Stronger, we pride ourselves on providing personalized service that will take your physique and knowledge to the next level. If you're interested, check the description and sign up.
Isn't that good though? Because the lats are at a profound stretch and simultaneous mechanical disadvantage. And thus, without having to load any extra weight on a pull-up, or even if you just choose to do pull-downs or assisted pull-ups, you can, with sets of 15, for example, reps, at the very top where it's most hypertrophic for the lats, produce an unreal amount of tension because of that mechanical disadvantage. It's kind of like letting your knees scoot way past your toes in a squat is insanely disadvantageous from how much force production you can get into like a bar or something, but it actually probably more hypertrophic. So isn't that a similar idea that like at the very bottom of a squat, like if here's your knee, a lot of that first part is the shit pulling right into itself. But that's kind of good though, right? So if it's good there, why is it bad for the lats?
Well, when you're doing a hack squat and you're pulling your feet under you, and that allows your tibia to get more perpendicular to the direction of resistance, that's obviously an external mechanical thing that you've created rather than the internal thing that's happening, right? So I always talk about perpendicularness being a wonderful thing. In fact, that's why in the book, I'm sure I say this too, this whole idea about not letting your knees go over your toes when you're squatting was ridiculous from the very beginning, because you're basically saying keep your shin parallel to resistance. And of course, parallel to resistance gives you no load. Perpendicularness is what gives you load. So that's sort of a different thing. When you're talking about mechanical disadvantage, you're talking about the internal moment arm. And so what I say is if you start with a pulley that's right about there, you're still at a mechanical disadvantage, right? You're still pulling in this angle, right? You're just not pulling at such a severe mechanical disadvantage, and you enter mechanical advantage slightly sooner. And if the direction of resistance is there rather than there, then when your arm is about here, you're going to have a perpendicular angle with your upper arm. You're going to get loading kind of in the mid-range. And when you pull all the way in, you're still going to get some loading. Whereas if you had the resistance going straight up, you're going to get very little loading at the end. You're going to get most of the loading earlier. So,
but isn't early loading good?
Well, you are getting early loading, but try that one arm pulling. And what I find is it's very similar to what the mechanics of the bicep. In other words, I don't want early loading on my bicep. I don't want to put my arm on a tabletop and do a curl like this because I've got a combination. Because I've got a combination of loading from this lever being perpendicular to gravity, and I've got mechanical disadvantage, right? So this is you may have seen that video of that guy tearing both his biceps during preacher curl. Have you seen that?
There's a few videos like that.
Well, there's this one. It's I hate to say.
How much weight was he using? What percent of his max?
What's funny is he had this little scale right here on the side. I'd have to look at the numbers, but it had something like 60 pounds, 70 pounds, 80 pounds, 90 pounds. And he was showing like a second or two from each one. And when he got somewhere right around 130 pounds, boom, they both snapped at the same time.
It was a maximum lift.
And they both snapped at the bottom where the mechanical disadvantage is. And in my book, I also show some people tearing their biceps during deadlifts. And what I say is that when you've got double magnification, you've got the limb crossing resistance either very perpendicularly or semi-perpendicularly. And at the same time, you've got maximum mechanical disadvantage. You've got double loading of a flexion muscle, and that's when biceps tear, or that's when a hamstring can tear, or theoretically, that's when a lat could tear. So what I say is, when you're doing a standing dumbbell curl, you're starting with a 0 moment arm, external moment arm, but a maximum internal moment arm. You've got maximum mechanical disadvantage at the beginning of the movement because your elbow is straight. So any kind of load in the beginning is going to be magnified by a factor of at least 10, if not more.
Why is that bad?
That's good. That's good.
But why are we avoiding it with the lat?
No, what I'm saying is it's okay to experience mechanical disadvantage, but not at the same time of maximum external loading.
Is that, it seems to be an argument more for like, don't do 1 rep maxes than it is for don't get into certain positions. Because in like the bodybuilding rep ranges, it's a bodybuilding book, I guess. Like sets of 5 to sets of 30, very big range. Going through a full range of motion, the chances for acute injury are super, very profoundly low. So, yeah, sure as hell, like, I'm not going to try to curl as much as possible 1RM in any position, including at a mechanical disadvantage.
Yeah.
So maybe that's more of an argument for like, don't do 1RMs versus don't get into a mechanical disadvantage at higher reps.
The first thing you'd have to acknowledge, I guess you could say, is that if you emphasize load on one end, you de-emphasize it on the other end. That's normal, right? If you're doing a leg extension with a boot, you're going to get 0 at the bottom, maximum at the top. If you're sitting down, if you get on your back, it's going to be the opposite, right? Maximum at the bottom, minimum at the top. So if you take away a little bit of the resistance from the bottom, from the beginning of the range of motion here, you're going to add it slightly later in the range of motion when your mechanical advantage is better. So when the resistance is less at the top, you've got enough resistance because of your mechanical disadvantage. Then as your mechanical advantage improves, you compensate for that by adding more resistance because now you're more perpendicular.
But pending the theoretical understanding and the research literature on where muscles grow the most, don't we want to bias that sort of as it is naturally biased, that the most difficult part of the lift should be for example, the most disadvantageous part, and then the easier part should be closer towards the bottom because the top stretch part is the most growth promoting? Like, isn't that already kind of a self-solving problem? Like if we're trying to make it easier for the lats at the top, are we not making it less force production requisite when force production is paired with stretch precisely when it's the best? It seems to me that what a good way to lift as much weight as possible in exercise would be to make sure not to lift the weight through the mechanically disadvantageous part of the range of motion. So for example, like if I'm doing pull-ups from here to here, I can do 90 pounds on my waist. But if I'm doing them all the way from here, all the way to here, then maybe I can just do my own body weight for a few reps. So isn't it, but that second part, the whole big stretch, isn't that what causes the most hypertrophy anyway? So if we're talking to power lifters or people that want to lift a lot of weight, maybe it's good to start with a maybe not fully extended position. But for bodybuilders who are training in higher rep ranges, isn't it a good idea for most of the tension to be up here and then less tension to be at the bottom? Or do you not think that's the case?
Well, there's 2 things here. And the first thing I want to talk about is you said, if you do a pull down, you can't bring it down as far, right? Now, if your hands are on a pull down bar, they're going to be about, I guess, maybe 3.5 feet apart, right? So
I'm not that tall. It'd be like a foot for me. I'm just kidding.
Well, if they're 3.5 feet at the top, they're going to be 3.5 feet at the bottom, right? So the advantage of using one arm at a time, one cable at a time, is you can start wide, but you can see that if you end it here, there's no way you're going to have 1.5 feet here and 3 feet. So that's why one arm is better. That's one reason why one arm is better.
Sorry, I'm not arguing against the one arm. I'm just arguing against not going to a full extension and the consideration that a full extension in bodybuilding repetition ranges is dangerous, which is the claim here that the full extension part is risky. And I understand that if you're doing 1 rep maxes, yeah, for sure. But if we're talking to bodybuilders, then maybe if they're training through a normal rep range for bodybuilders, it would maybe sets of 5 all the way to sets of 30, then we kind of want to enter that super stretched position at the top. We want that mechanical disadvantage. And actually maybe for another reason. So for example, if I curl all the way through the range of motion, I can maybe only use 20 pounds. And thus, if I'm standing up and curling the 20s, my skeleton with the axial fatigue that generates only has to fuck with, 40 pounds or something like that. But if I'm curling, not, standing up, by the way, if I'm curling just to here and then back, not through a full extension, missing that mechanical disadvantage allows me to use maybe the 30s. Now is 60 pounds of total axial loading through my spine. And that's more axial fatigue and more deleterious over the long term because it saps your energy from everything else. So maybe by really leaning into the mechanical disadvantage, precisely getting into the positions like up here with lat pull downs, instead of here, we go all the way here, maybe that mechanical disadvantage allows the muscles to work against themselves, minimizing external loading and thus minimizing fatigue. Because I think a lot of the other stuff you talk about in the book, which I think is awesome, is ways in which you can take your body and move it such that the external load doesn't have to be super high, but the muscles experience a lot of hypertrophic benefit.
Right.
Wouldn't the super range of motion for something like the lats be exactly that, as opposed to limiting their extension to here? And thus we would have to use more external load to accomplish the same task? What do you think?
Right. Well, there's two things. One is the direction of the load, the direction of the resistance basically determines not only which muscles are most loaded, but to the degree that they're loaded. I don't know if you saw that one chapter where I explain here. Let me see if I can pop this up real quick here. See, your book is different than my book because I think the PDF was expanded so that it could accommodate bigger pictures and color pictures. Whereas this is black and white. And so they were trying to save on the printing. And as a result of that, they're, I can't quite find it. They're minimizing the number of pages. Anyway, if in my book, I have this picture where I show a clock, right? And I show a man pulling a rope from a 7 o'clock direction. And I say, if this is the direction of the resistance, the muscle that's going to be—
Where is the man in this case? Or is he in the middle of the clock?
Well, the clock is up there. He's down here pulling a rope through a clock, through the 7 o'clock hour. He's down here, he's pulling through the 7 o'clock hour. And directly across from that is the 2 o'clock position. So there's a big dot on the 2 o'clock position, smaller dot on the 1 and the 3, smaller dot on the 12 and the 4, to show that whatever muscle is directly opposite the line of force will be the muscle that is most loaded, right? So one of the criteria that we try to do when we're loading a muscle is to make sure that the direction of the resistance is going to perpendicularly, straight across the line of force, load the origins of that target muscle. Well, the latissimus fibers are obviously diagonal, right? And so they go at an angle like that, right? So when the resistance is coming from over there, the load is going all the way to, the line of force is going all the way to those origins. If the direction of resistance is straight up, you're not straight across from those latissimus origins. So you're going to get much less loading and you're going to get more stretch, yes, but you're not going to get the kind of maximum percentage loading that you get when that resistance is directly opposite the origin of those fibers. That's number one. Number two is I would encourage you, and I would encourage anyone, to just do one simple experiment. And that would be do a single pulley, pull down from here to here, and then do a single pulley, pull in from there to there. And then you decide which one you like better. It's a slam dunk as far as I'm concerned. This feels awesome. This feels like it's a little bit more shoulder motion than I want. Maybe not really impinging, but it's slightly uncomfortable here. I'm getting a hard time getting across this early part. And then when I'm down here, I have very little loading because I'm mostly parallel to the direction of resistance. Whereas this is giving you a much more natural feeling. Just try it. I mean, it's pretty noticeable. It's not even close.
Do you think that if the lats generate less force when loaded this way through this way, that it's less risk of injury to the lats because they're generating less force here than here?
I'm not so much concerned about lat risk as much as I'm concerned about just excessive shoulder motion, going into an area of shoulder movement that is fine. I can certainly do this without any load. I can certainly hang from a chinning bar without any, but trying to make my humeruses go out as they would have to go to do this, for starting from this position feels very uncomfortable for me. And not because my shoulders have been injured, just feels very, very uncomfortable to me, as opposed to starting a little sooner and then ending with more resistance at the end.
You're not worried about that missing the stretch component. That's not.
I think I'm getting
it's
in.
worth the trade-off.
Yeah, I think I'm getting enough. I think I'm getting enough elongation for the same reason why I think that, when you're doing biceps or once you're getting into the heavier weight, I think it's fine. Stretching a muscle is fine. Like there's nothing wrong with grabbing, as we all do. We grab a dip bars and we pull on it. Stretching something without maximum load is perfectly fine. But to maximum load a muscle when you're, in that maximum stretch position, it feels a little dangerous to me.
All right. Yeah, that's all the questions I have. So
I don't know how much. It sounds like you didn't read the whole thing. And Steve, if you didn't get past, what did you say, chapter 7 or 8?
I got to chapter 8.
At chapter 8. So you didn't see any of the body part chapters. Sounds like Michael just went directly to the body part chapters. And so you guys read the opposite sides of the book. The body part chapters, which are 18 through 25, basically, explain how the principles that I discuss in the first 16 chapters apply in those exercises. And I think, I don't know, my goal is to have it sensible. My goal is to have this be logical, right? So for example, the line of force, as I explained, if I give you a rope and I tie the other end to a box and I tell you to pull on that rope, that box is going to move toward you and only toward you, all right? Unless if you want it to move somewhere else, you're going to have some assistance. You're going to have another guy pulling over there. And maybe if you pull equally, it'll go somewhere in between you, right? But muscles always pull toward their origin. So one of the first things that I explain is that we have to make sure that the direction of anatomical motion is right? And we have to make sure the direction of resistance is directly opposite the muscle origins, right? So for example, a lot of times we see people doing front deltoids like this. Well, what is opposite resistance? The side deltoid, right? Now, if you rotate your arm around, now you're moving your side deltoid away from the line of force. Now, because your elbow is down, now you've got your front deltoid. Now, if you do this, now you're going to get front deltoid. But as long as your elbow is up and your palm is down, you're actually not working much more front deltoid than you were when it was going to the side. So the first thing I would say is turn your hand around, palm up. The second thing I would say is make it early phase loading. If you're doing a standing barbell front raise, you're end phase loaded, right? And so you're sort of inviting a certain swinging. If you get on your back and you take a pair of dumbbells and you go like this, you go, holy shit, I'm really feeling this in my front deltoids, in part because now you've positioned the front deltoid directly opposite resistance and you've early phase loaded it. So those are the kinds of things that are just sensible that we all should be doing, that we never sort of stopped and asked, is a front deltoid, front barbell thing really the best front deltoid exercise? Why was I feeling dips in the front deltoid? Well, because that's the line of travel. I'm moving away from the origin on the clavicle and I'm stretching it, right? Except I'm not ending where the front deltoid contracts. It ends right around there. So that's why parallel bar dips aren't a great front deltoid exercise, even though they work the front deltoid. So my goal has been to say, what is the best movement? And why don't we just focus on the best movements? Why don't we do the exercise that might rate a 2 or a 3 on a scale of 1 to 10, in addition to the one that rates a 7 or an 8 or a 9, instead of just going for the 9 or the 10? And if we think, well, that's not enough. And I'd say, well, just do more sets of the 9 or 10.
What if you develop some staleness or something? Do you think there's a place for variation there?
Well, it's funny. If you're talking about the variation that says, well, let's vary from a movement that goes directly from taking the insertion to the origin and vary it to an exercise that takes it not quite to the origin, but somewhere over there, I would say that's inferior. That's not as good as. If you want variation, periodize. Periodize, change your reps, change your sets, change your frequency. There's all kinds of things.
Not the exercise selection.
But not the exercise, because when you boil it all down, you say, is early phase loading better or worse than late phase loading? Better than. If you do a late phase loaded exercise like a tricep kickback, a tricep kickback is not as productive as a skull crusher. Serious. Now, you can get sore from a tricep kickback because it's novel, right? But end phase loads is inferior. So now someone could say, well, don't you need some resistance at the end of the range of motion? And I would say, well, I wouldn't mind it, but I don't want to sacrifice the early phase to get it.
Like a deadlift.
Yeah, I mean, like, for example, the multi-hip machine is continuous tension, right? I don't mind that I'm getting resistance at the end of the range of motion because I'm not sacrificing the early part. But I don't want to sacrifice the early part. So when you boil it down and you say, what are the factors that determine productivity, safety, energy efficiency, you're always going to get a better result, a better energy efficiency ratio when you use a limb that's more perpendicular resistance than parallel to it. Okay, that's one. You're always going to get better with early phase loading than late phase. Okay, fine. What about alignment? What about a bilateral deficit? What about active and passive insufficiency? What about all these things that can either compromise or not compromise the productivity of an exercise? Why don't we just do the ones that have the least compromises, that have the best energy efficiency? Why not just do those? Right. And that's what I've been doing now for the last at least 10 years. And I am thoroughly enjoying my training. I'm 62 years old and getting probably better results than some people get at 30 years old with a more conventional method.
Yeah, you look amazing, by the way.
And by
if
the
I'm
way,
alive at 62, I'll consider that a victory.
And by the way, I learn a lot from the periodization stuff that you teach and the stuff that I read from Chris Beardsley. I just recently switched from a 4 and a 5-way split to a 3-way split. And now I work, this is blowing my mind, because when I was starting out in Bill Pearl's gym, I was all about sort of instinctive training. I always went for the burn. I always went for the pump. 6 days a week, to each body part twice per week. And I got really good results. And then throughout the years, I kept hearing that, it was okay to work a body part once a week, that volume is really important, that you can get as much growth without going to failure if you're going heavy enough. And pretty soon I was going into a 5-way split, each muscle group getting worked, let's say twice every 8 to 12 days. And dissatisfied with the results I was getting and chalking it up to, well, I'm 60 years old. What do you expect, right? And then I started seeing more and more of this research that said you can get as much muscle growth with lighter weight, higher reps if you go to failure. So the first thing I did is this last New Year's, I said, oh, the hell with it. I'm just going to go 3 days a week, full body, 2 sets of body part, 30 reps on the first set to failure, 20 reps on the second set to failure. And boom, I started growing like crazy. And then I said, I want to do one more set, so I'm going to split it a little bit. And I went a 2-way split. And then I went a 3-way split. So now I'm doing 4 sets twice a week to failure, and I'm getting fantastic results. So, you can teach an old dog new trick. I'm always open to saying, hey, I was wrong about this. And I'm sorry I recommended this, but, clearly, I thought it was right then. This is what I was told. This is what the research was suggesting back then. I went with it. I preached it. I'm sorry, but clearly maybe because I'm sort of ectomorphic, maybe I respond better to higher reps and higher fatigue than the guy who's more mesomorphic or endomorphic, who maybe grows well on 4 and 6 rep sets, or just as well or maybe better than on 15 and 20 rep sets. But for me, 15s and 20s are the bomb.
They sure hurt, man. And sometimes when I'm training, I find that, different muscle groups of mine respond somewhat better and worse to higher and lower reps. And sometimes I don't know which one's like worse psychologically, because on the one hand, if you have, let's say my hamstrings tend to respond pretty well to lower reps. So then I'm like looking at how much I have to do good mornings with. And I'm like, I don't want to be here. Damn it. Why is this 300 and whatever pounds? I don't want to die. But then on the other hand, when I let's say my biceps respond well to higher reps or something, or my lats, I don't want to do 30 reps. That shit hurts, man. And it burns the crap out of me. And I want to throw up after. And then at some point, it's just a whole lot of wrong answers. And I think maybe one of my big takeaways, I think 2 years ago, I came up with this. I was trying to synthesize a lot of literature in my head, writing the hypertrophy book. And every little sort of arrow I made, it ended up being, I think the grand unifying principle is
doesn't matter specifically as much what you do. Of course, it matters what you do specifically, but whichever way you get to muscle growth has to be some kind of hard. It's like if there's this treasure chest inside this mountain, is either you go through Medusa or you go through Zeus. You're going to have to fight a god one way or the other. You want 8 trillion snake heads and the blindness eyes, or do you want the lightning bolts? You're going to have to get it one way or another. So I think it's always funny when you can see this on the internet too, YouTube questions and Reddit and stuff. When people, their line of questioning is clearly not directed at how do I get the best results? It's directed seemingly, ostensibly, at how to get the best results, but they're weaving their line through how do I avoid either really heavy injury risk or the pain of the burn of high reps. And I think a big takeaway that I've taken over my whatever years of training is like, it's one or the other, man, or right in the middle where it's both. You know, like such a 15 of leg press where people are like, is it heavy? You're like, yes. Like, does it burn? Also, yes. So I think a lot of times, I think if you're really interested in growing the most muscle, the idea that you want to avoid unnecessary discomfort is an absolutely great idea. But you have to get your head around the fact that necessary discomfort is never going anywhere. Yeah. And if you fight it, you just won't get your best gains. You know what I mean? Yeah. Doug, do you think there's some merit to that? Like you just have to accept a certain amount of difficulty is going to come with the act?
Well, I think those of us that have been in the trench, we know that if you're doing the set right, you're going to dread doing the set.
Yeah.
You're going to dread it. I mean, you're literally like, oh, fuck, do I really want to do this? Because you know you're going to get in the red zone.
Yeah.
And the red zone is agonizing.
Yeah.
It really tests your character. It really, because your brain is telling you that your body is failing, but it actually isn't failing yet. It's telling you to stop, and it's fooling you into thinking, oh, no, you're done. No. It's still moving. The weight is still moving. It's just fucking burning like crazy. And that's where the growth happens. And if you avoid it, you're not going to get the growth.
Yeah. You know, I think we're all, especially myself as being a, sort of practicing scientist, we're doing a real bad job about this, Steve, because there's all the science to explain how you should train. We still haven't gotten around the idea that it's hard. Damn it. I pay a lot of money for science. I want these motherfuckers to come up with some way in which I grow with no effort at all. I'm tired of trying. I've been trying for 22 years in the gym. Let's get out of this effort thing, dog. We're in the wrong business.
But I would say though, that you've got to be courageous. There's no doubt. You've got to be courageous. You got to go into your set knowing the shit's going to burn like crazy. It's going to test my willpower. And that's all there is to it. That's fine. What I think happens is that there's a mentality that says the harder, the better. And there is a limit. Mm-hmm. There is a limit. There is such a thing as overtraining.
Yes.
It's easy to fall into it.
Yes. First, you have to set an intelligent course through which you will go. But then whatever comes through that intelligent course, you just have to take the pain. But if you're saying, I don't care about the pain, and you choose an unintelligent course, well, as per one of the pages of your book, you will be round back deadlifting for no reason at all. And then your back's going to hurt. You're going to say, well, I'm not even that much more jacked. I have tons of fatigue. So I think there's a bit of nuance there where once you have decided to train relatively intelligently, and as you mentioned earlier, that's a lifelong process of discovering, kind of making it more intelligent over time. Yes, intelligence sets the course, but then you're going to get into some difficulty. So as long as the difficulty is logical, go right through. But if the difficulty is stupid, then maybe rethink it.
And one of the questions that we get all the time is how many sets and how many reps? And it's like, it's kind of the dumbest question in the world, because you're talking about a lot of sets with a lightweight, or you're talking about, because a lot of times what happens is someone says, well, I used to do, 4 sets and now I'm up to 8 sets. And I'd say, well, I'd like to see what those 8 sets look like.
Yeah. Oh my.
Because if you can go beyond 4 sets to failure, then you're probably, done in 4 sets, maybe 5 sets. But, if you're lasting to 8 sets, you're not maximizing each of those sets.
Well, it's funny. Today I did a workout just before we got on this talk. It was the last week before deloading, and it was 5 sets of hack squats, and then 3 sets of lunges, 2 with weight, and 1 at the end with no weight. And it's only, like, technically, if you count lunges as a quad exercise, which I do in part, that it's only 8 sets for quads. And I know for almost fact, because it happens basically every time, I posted on my social media this workout, and at least one person almost every time asks, only 8 sets for quads. Yeah, it's really, are you out of your fucking mind? Have you ever done 8 hard sets for quads? Your blood will come out of your eyes. But then you see people train in many corporate gyms and they're like, they do a set of 10 leg extensions with their 35 RM and they're like, ooh, that was tough. And then they do 10 more sets and still don't sweat. And they're like, oh, 10 sets of quads, slow clap for myself.
Yeah. I mean, each of my workouts takes about an hour. And in an hour of doing to failure sets, I feel nauseous.
Oh, yeah.
And if it's legs, all the more because you're using all that much more glucose, right? So there's just no way when you see people working out for 2 hours at a time, it's like you're wasting time in there.
What is it that you're doing? You know, it's funny you say 2 hours. I used to have, I was advocating that if you got strong enough as a power lifter, that you should split up your workouts into more weekly sessions, because especially for powerlifting, you only have so much time to have a lot of energy in the gym. Right. And I had guys ask me, they say, hey, I liked your 6-day plan for powerlifting. I thought that was great. Can I condense the workouts into just 3 weekly workouts? And I'm like, how long is that going to take you? They're like 3.5 hours. I'm like, can you guys imagine being in the gym for 3.5 fucking hours and calling that anything? Like, are you really trying any fraction of that time? Or are you just like scroll on your phone and watch? I never understood that. I just never got it.
By the way, I'm sure you've read some of Chris Beardsley's articles.
I have many.
And they're fascinating. And you have to really look for clues because sometimes you don't know which audience he's talking to. And so you have to look for those clues. Sometimes he's not very clear about it. So like he'll talk about, avoiding failure. He's not talking to the bodybuilder. As it turns out, when you train to failure, you're actually counterproductive for power and you're counterproductive for sport. Because once the muscle gets to a certain level of fatigue, it loses its coordination.
Oh, sure.
And once that happens, it's out the window.
I remember one, there was, I think, a question about, should I do power cleans to failure? And this YouTube personality was like, what does that even look like? And the answer is not like
really
the power
sloppy
anymore.
Really sloppy.
Right?
And that's all about technique. That's all about technique.
Sure.
You're not nailing that, which, by the way, concerns me about the CrossFit because they're doing a lot of these things with really bad form because they're taking it so far into fatigue against the clock.
Yes, they have gotten way better about it. Back when I first started looking into CrossFit as a master's student, 2006, 2007, there was some unbelievable stuff going on, but they just have CrossFit moms do like a log press for reps. And you're like, okay, that woman's going to die, but they have gotten better. But it's CrossFit done properly. CrossFit is one of the hardest sports in the world, right? Because the question that you could be like, so what is demanded of you in CrossFit? The answer is everything. Is it a technique sport? Yes. Is it a rep sport? Yes. It is endurance sport? Yes. So true CrossFit athletes, they have really good technique now and they're all good. But there's always that person who it's like, it's my first week of CrossFit. Here's what I'm doing. And I guess the coach just didn't see them yet when they posted that video because somebody should be taking them the hell away from that power cleans to failure or whatever. At some point, it's just like a religious experience where the bar does something, your body does something. It's like a burpee standing up. That's my best explanation.
But by the way, this is why I like weight training so much, is because there's no randomness to it. When you're talking about a sport,
ideally,
right? It's methodical. It's in a groove. It's got a precision beginning, middle, and end. And look, I've been injured a number of times, never while training. I tore my bicep while salsa dancing.
Get out of here. Okay. Because, I have to go in like 2 minutes, but Doug, please tell us that story.
All right. It was just,
I had this strange the imagination.
No. It's not, it wasn't typical salsa dancing. My teacher wanted me to do a floor sweep where you throw her on the ground and you drag her on the floor in a circle and then you pop her up to her feet. And then when you pop her up to her feet, bam, there went the bicep.
Were you pissed? I'd be furious. I'd be like, what the fuck did that happen?
I was freaked out. But it's the randomness. It's when something happens at a particular moment that you least expect it. Doesn't happen in the gym because everything in the gym, if you're doing the right thing, you're doing it with form. You're doing methodically.
Hopefully.
So anyway, listen, I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Likewise, Doug. Thank you so much. Thank you. And Steve, Steve, you could really say something. I mean, it's quite rude for you just not to speak to us at all. I will say.
You guys were just too nice to one another. I didn't need to step in and be my British.
Steve, thank you so much for allowing us to be on your forum.
No, of course. It was an enjoyable discussion between you both. I'm going to do a bit of a summary once you guys are off maybe you'll listen to it and you can critique me if I'm wrong, but I think there's some great take homes between you both, and it was a great chat between you, and I appreciate being able to host it.
This is the kind of conversation the industry should be having. Good, intelligent, sensible conversation about maybe some theoreticals, some things that are proven, some things that, you know, we have opinions about. It's good stuff.
Very good stuff. Doug, thank you so much for chatting.
Thank you, sir. Okay.
Steve, if you had to step in, you would have full authority derived entirely from your mustache. I mean, look at that thing. You could be a police officer without having a badge or registration.
That's the only reason I have it.
I respect it, right? Doug, I'm scared. I'm like, did I break any laws here?
What did I do? What did
I do? All right, guys.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you so much.
We'll talk to you soon. I'll make sure everyone
great.
knows where they can reach out to your stuff and see where they can learn more. That will be in the description box below. So thank you so much, guys.
Thank you, guys. Okay, have a good day.
Guys, take care.
Hey guys, so hopefully you really enjoyed the particularly valuable discussion towards the end there. I think there was a lot of nuance discussed right at the start. Some of it may have gone over your heads, especially if you were listening to just the audio, because there was quite a lot of visual elements going on. So you may want to go check that over on YouTube. But I think overall the guys were coming from a similar standpoint. They're both just trying to maximize hypertrophy, maximize the stimulus, and reduce the unnecessary fatigue cost. They aren't trying to make things easy. They are trying to make things not unnecessarily hard, trying to avoid unnecessary fatigue for the best outcomes. So I have 4 kind of take homes. When Mike went through his points one by one, I was kind of trying to come to some points of conclusions where the guys saw eye to eye and what seemed to make sense to me. And the first one was to not go below 5 repetitions. Doesn't seem to make much sense in terms of the SFR trade-off for hypertrophy. Maybe reduce the range of motion when things are really heavy, or instead maybe pause the lift. Make sure just not to bounce and really control the end ranges for those muscle groups that are at risk of injury there, and if it feels a bit injurious to you. Secondly, there has to be some axial loading in life for kind of best health. You just don't want excessive amounts of that. Upper chest, you just don't want to go too high. You want to move kind of insertion to origin, and you can test this. See how you feel from just flat pressing versus like an incline. See what incline feels best to you. See where gets sore, that sort of thing. Thirdly, the seated leg curl might be superior to the straight leg deadlift as a sole exercise, but maybe not, because it has the fuller ROM, but it's so important to train muscle groups in the stretch position. This made me think about maybe using kind of just the first portion of the seated leg curl and just going ham at that. But I think it's just important to have a mix of exercises within your program that are complementary, that are providing that kind of best stimulus to fatigue trade-off. So maybe you don't do tons of straight leg deadlifts, maybe you only do a couple of sets a week, maybe. That's something I'm doing at the moment. And you fill in the rest with some leg curls that are very, very stimulating and good exercise, but for less fatigue cost. Then the fourth point I have is to be careful and try and avoid those injurious positions. So this is such as the end range on a preacher curl. There's a mechanical disadvantage and max loading at the same time. And when you're going heavy for that, it can be quite injurious. So just like I said before, don't go below 5 repetitions. Don't try and 1 rep max your things. Control the end ranges. Don't bounce out of these positions, and that's probably the way to go. So guys, hopefully those take homes have been useful to you. Hopefully this discussion was really useful. Hopefully you learned something new. It certainly was very interesting for me sitting on the other end, listening to these guys go back and forth. It looks like I'm maybe not contributing much, but certainly my head is spinning and lots is going in there. So yeah, it was a great chat. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Take care. As always, do like, subscribe, share it around. We appreciate you. Take care, guys. Revive stronger. So I'm Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger and a coach of Revive Stronger.
My name is Pascal Florent. I'm the co-owner of Revive Stronger and also a coach, of course.
Revive Stronger has probably been going solidly for 3 years, probably, roughly about 3 years.
Revive Stronger, to me, it is becoming kind of my child, my foster child. It's the gathering and getting together of like-minded people.
We've been expanding the coaching team, which is helping us help more people, but each coach can only help a certain number of people.
Right now, it's all over the place. We have YouTube, we have Facebook, we have Instagram, but there isn't that community aspect behind that.
And so the next step for us is developing a membership site.
So basically, we want to create a family and a community that is then benefiting from another.
A really cool community for people within our little niche is going to be a website.
They will get early access to our podcast.
You can access us, ask us questions.
The community aspect, we have a forum there. You can ask questions, but also you can log your journey.
There's also going to be courses on there.
Courses, presentations on different topics. Discount of past seminar footage. We will log our journey as well. We'll start vlogging.
We're going to have documentaries.
Our entire athletic journey. Furthermore, they get access to an exercise video library.
The exercises that we love for hypertrophy and maximizing hypertrophy, we're going to go through those in depth, telling you how to execute them.
We kept them concise and also mobile friendly so that you can watch them in between your sets.
I'm super excited to grow this community. The amount of value that we're going to be delivering is huge. And I'd love you to be part of it.
You will get so much out of that.
I'll see you inside.